Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari has just wrapped up his first state visit to China, and it is an important one for Africa's largest economy. Now, during the 5-day trip, he has negotiated various deals between the countries, as well as a low-interest loan from China worth billions of US dollars. It comes at a time when the West African nation faces a $15 billion US budget deficit and is still seeking funding for various infrastructural projects. So will this economic lifeline be able to pull Nigeria out of its fiscal slump? And what lessons can the rest of the continent take away from Buhari's first visit to China? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, this is the Nigerian President Buhari's first state visit to China since taking office, and he is also the first head of state from Africa to visit China after last year's FOCAC summit in Johannesburg. He met with President Xi Jinping in Beijing, where the two leaders agreed to strengthen cooperation in various fields, including infrastructure, agriculture, energy and trade. CCTV Su Yuting has more.
This is Nigerian President Buhari's first state visit to China since taking office, and he's also the first head of state from Africa to visit China after last year's FOCAC Johannesburg summit. President Buhari has led a huge delegation comprising ministers of transportation, power and housing, trade, industry and investment. President Xi Jinping held a welcoming ceremony for Buhari at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Buhari is the first African leader that President Xi has received this year in the Chinese capital. President Xi has met with President Buhari twice previously in Johannesburg and New York, and this is the third meeting between the two leaders within the year. Xi Jinping said this indicates the special significance of China-Nigeria ties.
今年是中伊建交45周年。
This year marks 45 years of diplomatic ties between the two nations, and the two sides have achieved fruitful results in boosting the relationship, with lots of firsts in China-Africa ties. Nigeria is the first African country to utilize Chinese technical standards to construct the modern railway, the first to import a Chinese communication satellite, the first to cooperate with China to conduct the joint marine research program, the first to put RMB into its foreign currency reserves. Now China has become Nigeria's largest contractor of infrastructure construction projects, its second trading partner. This brings substantial benefits to the people of both countries.
President Buhari praised China's social and economic development and said there is great potential for further cooperation between the two sides, especially in areas such as agriculture and infrastructure. The two leaders also witnessed the signing of 6 documents on economic, industrial, aviation, financial, scientific and technological cooperation.
President Xi Jinping told President Buhari during the meeting that China wanted to help Nigeria address 3 bottlenecks impeding the country's development, namely the underdeveloped infrastructure, lack of skilled talent and financial support. The two sides have a good foundation with regards to economic and trade cooperation. By the end of last year, the total volume of project contracts by Chinese companies in Nigeria reached $77.3 billion US dollars, and the bilateral trade volume reached $15 billion US dollars, accounting for 1/14 of the total trade volume between China and Africa.
Nigeria is the largest economy in Africa, but the country is still in need of infrastructure projects. China has the technical and financial capacity to help Nigeria improve its infrastructure, promote industrialization, and tackle the challenge of unemployment. Just as President Buhari said, this is the cooperation opportunity that Nigeria cannot afford to lose. Su Yuting, CCTV, Beijing.
Now, back in Abuja, Nigerians are hopeful that President Buhari's visit will stimulate their economy after the sustained fall in the price of oil. CCTV Sophia Adengo spoke to former Nigerian Chief Economic Advisor Dr. Magnus Kopakol to get a sense of the country's expectations.
Dr. Magnus, of what significance is President Muhammadu Buhari's visit to China in relation to China and Nigeria's bilateral relations? And how are the two personalities of President Muhammadu Buhari and President Xi Jinping solidifying through this visit?
When President Xi Jinping meets with President Buhari, they are meeting as leaders with the biggest populations, the biggest economies in their respective zones. And as you probably know, Nigeria is trying to rise to that realization that we should be a leader, if not the leader in Africa. Of course, never minding that the South African economy is a little bit more complex, more sophisticated, but at least Nigeria can say we have the largest economy. And so I'm coming to talk to you as a brother, a president, from another region that stakes claim to the largest population and the largest economy. And I think also from what I've seen between President Buhari and Xi Jinping in their prior meetings, especially the recent one in Washington, D.C. during the Energy Summit, there was a very good cordiality that was witnessed between them. And I think also President Buhari is the first president to be visiting China since the Forum on the China-Africa Cooperation. So it must really say something about the sort of future relationship that both leaders anticipate for themselves.
Nigeria's economy has gone through significant volatility in the last 12 months with an over-dependency on oil revenues that have seen almost a 50% drop on the international markets. How important is Nigeria's engagement with China in trying to recover Nigeria's economy?
I think that China recognizes that here is a potential big-time player in the years to come. And Nigeria has been, until now, one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. And of course, with the size of the economy, the population, and of course, with the sort of focus that China now has towards Africa, it would be misplaced if you were not looking at the biggest player, or at least the potentially biggest player in the years to come. So never minding that Nigeria is going through this patch, is the way I call it, is the way I describe it and characterize it. Nigeria is going through this patch, and everybody knows that the country will have to struggle to try to adjust to the environment. Unfortunately, as everyone also knows, Nigeria did not really seem to have prepared for this, because the economy could have been better diversified than it is. It is diversified to a reasonable extent. I remember a few years back when I was in the government, I was the economic advisor to the president, and that was just a few years ago. The agriculture represented about 42% of GDP in Nigeria. Now it represents at most 23% of GDP, as the services sector has really grown really large. And industry in total is about 23% of GDP, much larger than it was before. So there are signs that truly this is a country that has to be a big-time player. And if China is looking to hedge its bets, looking to be prepared to not be too dependent on the West, looking for alternatives, then suddenly Africa is the place to be looking. And if Africa is the place, then Nigeria is an obvious destination for China in terms of their products when they want to sell them.
What is the economic outlook for Nigeria in bolstering more economic activity specific to the West African region?
Nigeria needs help now to be able to overcome the economic crisis, to go through this patch. I understand that the $6 billion loan that the Chinese have offered, for various kinds of infrastructure that Nigeria may want to get into. And then there's a swap arrangement that has also been discussed to shore up the value of the naira, which has suffered greatly in the parallel market. And so with this swap, Nigerians will be able to buy goods and services a little bit easier, and the central bank's pressure would be relieved somewhat. They won't have to have their currency I mean, the reserves, mostly denominated in dollars, depleted because they will have the yuan, they will have the renminbi also as a reserve instrument.
Now, during Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari's state visit to China, several deals were hammered out between the two countries. These include fresh credit lines and currency swap agreements. But what of the benefits? Well, CCTV's Ramanyang broke down those details for us.
Now, to properly understand the deals that have been arrived at between the leaders of these two countries, it's absolutely vital to understand the context in which they're being struck, especially the domestic context in Nigeria. Let's start with the headline numbers. At about $30 billion, the budget for the 2016 fiscal year is Nigeria's largest to date, and funding it will require a heady mix of local and foreign funding. Now, nearly half the budget, about $13 billion, is just basically recurrent expenditure. Capital expenditure at about $9 billion, however, stands to gain the most from foreign sources of funding. The thing is, though, it is not clear at this point in time exactly how the budget deficit, estimated at about $11.1 billion, is going to be filled, and the details are trickling in very slowly. So, for example, we know there's a $6 billion loan on offer from China to fund infrastructure projects. That could go a long way to fill that hole, but there's still several missing details, like, for example, the price of said debt, and if it's all coming in one shot or if it's going to be dispersed over several fiscal years. Panda bonds, which are basically yuan-dominated fixed-income instruments, have also been proposed by the Finance Minister, Kami Adeosun, although it's not clear exactly where they fit into the funding matrix. What we do know, though, is that the Finance Minister believes that they are cheaper relative to Eurobonds. Now, a deal was also signed between the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China and Nigeria Central Bank covering yuan transactions. Now, the simplest way of explaining it is it'll make the flow of yuan among different banks in Nigeria a lot easier. And of course, the question then from that point is, what scale will it have on the economy? The thing is, this deal, as interesting as it sounds on paper, will be limited by three main factors. You see, most of Nigeria's external trade is done in dollars, and that includes sales of its main export commodity, oil. Between 2013 and 2015, roughly a fifth of goods imported in Nigeria came from China, but less than 2% of Nigerian exports went to the Asian economy. Now, to put this into perspective, you're looking at the export of about $7 billion of capital every year from Nigeria to China, and the bulk of that is denominated in dollars. Most importantly, as long as the Central Bank of Nigeria's restrictions on foreign currency access remain in place, this deal cannot be a silver bullet to the Naira's current weakness.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, my expert guest will help further unpack the significance of President Buhari's trip to China. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, as Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari wrapped up his first state visit to China this week with a number of deals between the countries, I now have expert guests standing by to help break down the details. In Lagos, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, he's the Managing Director of Cowrie Asset Management Limited. In Johannesburg, Dr. Bob Wekesa, he's a postdoctoral fellow at the Witwatersrand University. And in Beijing, Dr. Liu Yufa, he's a former Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. To you all, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining in this conversation. Mr. Johnson Chukwu, to you in Lagos. Let me start off with you, though. President Buhari in China for his first state visit. What is interesting in this visit for you? What is standing out? What is the significance?
Well, I think for me, the most important thing is that the president went to deepen the relations between China and Nigeria. If you look at the trade flow between China and Nigeria, you actually realize that China is one of the most important trading partners of the country. China is the largest exporting country to the country, and about the 15th importing country to the country, so to Nigeria. So for a Nigerian president, it's absolutely necessary that we have a deeper relationship between the two countries. But beyond that, we're also seen a lot of support from the Chinese government in terms of infrastructure development. So the basic thing that the president has gone went to deepen that relationship, and we could see the series of agreements that were entered into by both presidents that actually signposted the benefit of that visitation.
Right. Dr. Liu Yufaf, in Beijing, what's the interesting perspective here from China?
Well, first of all, it is the privilege of the Chinese leader, President Xi Jinping, to meet with the African leaders since the China-Africa Cooperation Forum ministerial meeting to be held, which was held in Johannesburg last year. It is the golden opportunity for China to reconnect the Chinese leaders and the African leaders. Nigeria is one of the major, players on African affairs, and China and Nigeria are the major trading partners. Right at the moment, the bilateral trade between China and Nigeria standing at 14 billion US dollars. So, and the two countries have also had a very close cooperation investment. China has about 12 billion accumulative investment in Nigeria, and so to speak. Back to you.
Right. Dr. Bob Wekesa, though, this is the first visit by an African leader following the FOCAC summit in December of last year in Johannesburg. What are you seeing? What is interesting here?
I think for me what's interesting to start with is that there isn't really anything exemplary or extremely new in this, because the visit by President Buhari just builds on the China-Nigeria relations that have been going on since 1974, when the first Nigerian president visited China, President Yakubu Gowon. And usually the practice is that African presidents don't waste too much time after being elected to visit Beijing, to the great hall of the people. But then the fact that President Buhari took a bit of nearly a year to visit Beijing tells you that perhaps there was major reorganization in Nigeria under his regime, considering the new economic realities of oil not being a major source of income for an economy that relies about 80% of its budget on oil. So for me, I was just waiting for this to happen, and I'm happy it has happened now.
All right, Mr. Chukwu, I did notice that you were smiling there on that sentiment that perhaps President Buhari did take a little bit too long to have his first state visit to China. What's your thoughts?
Well, basically what could have happened was that, the president had focused so much on anti-corruption and fighting insurgency in the northeast of the country. And now that one can say that the president has a relatively good hang on the insurgency issue in the northeast, I think the president is now refocusing his attention to economic development. And China, being a critical economic partner of the country, will naturally be the next port of call. And I think that's what could have led to that delay. If you recast your mind back when the president was elected, the first thing he did was to rally around the countries that are part of the, that contributed weapon and military hardware to the fight in the northeast. So he first went to the neighboring countries, to Nigeria, Niger Republic, Chad, and all the Cameroon and the rest. But going forward, the president also went to some other countries that had been very active in supporting the the war against insurgency.
Right.
But like I said earlier, what the president is now doing is focusing more of his attention to economic development. And China is one of the prime countries that is critical to Nigeria's economic growth and development. So that's obviously why the president is now focusing attention on China.
Dr. Liu Yufaf, though, there are four main areas of interest that Nigeria has indicated, and that is power, infrastructure, transport, road, and agriculture in their state visit to China here. What is China's interest? Where will China be laying the focus here?
Well, as clearly indicated by President Xi Jinping when he was addressing the ministerial meetings of the China-African Cooperation Forum, China and Africa, Nigeria in particular, are natural friends or friends of all weather. Here are the areas where Chinese government is focusing on. First and foremost, countries like Nigeria is critically lacking the infrastructure, where China has the excellent construction capabilities. Nigeria is very much dependent on the importation of the manufactured goods because of the lack of the manufacturing sector. And when President Buhari is in Beijing, he and President Xi Jinping had a deep discussion on further promote the cooperation in this area so that China could help Nigeria to catch up with the manufacturing sector and also to balance out the trade between the two countries. Right at the moment, the trade is definitely lopsided in favor of China. So, and thirdly, oil is the major revenue for Nigeria when the commodity price, was sliding down. The financial situation in Nigeria is critical. And this is another reason for President Buhari to seek the financial support from the Chinese government. Indeed, when President Buhari was having discussion or talks with the Chinese president, the two presidents witnessed the signing of the loan agreement, which was totaled at $6 billion. And also the two governments also signed the currency swap agreement, which would help to stabilize the economic cooperative relations between the two countries.
Right.
Back to you.
Right. Bob, Dr. Wekesa, though, is this likely to look like, obviously Nigeria's economy is struggling at the moment as a result of the fall in oil prices. Is this likely to be a lifeline, though, for Nigeria's economy?
I think definitely so. I mean, Nigeria now must be looking out there to friends internationally that can plug the deficit arising out of the slump in the oil prices, which has been in play for some time now. You recall that the U.S. was one of the major importers of Nigerian crude. But once the U.S. kind of discovered its own shale oil, which is a new kind of technology of getting oil and gas, it slowed down importation, and therefore, in fact, at that point, then China became the leading importer of Nigerian crude. So I think China provides pathways in which Nigeria, a huge country, I mean Africa's foremost country in terms of GDP as well as population, as well as a vast country, and just a country that has lots of energy. It needs a partner like China to be able to leapfrog on certain fronts. In fact, one of the pickings that one might want to look at is that at the last FOCAC, industrialization was primed as one of the major pathways towards China-Africa cooperation. Now, you recall Nigeria has two special economic zones, which are essentially industrialization hubs, which have been developed now for well over a decade. So Nigeria provides an entry point, not only to West Africa, which is also equally a 15-nation region, but to the rest of Africa in terms of providing starting points, because the Lekki and Ogun special economic zones have been in place. Can they be enhanced? Can they be points for other African countries learning lessons in terms of China's move towards beefing up industrialization relations with Africa? The second very quick point that I can raise is that the visit by President Buhari must in essence be seen as a build-up on the visit by Premier Li Keqiang to Kenya, Ethiopia, Lagos, and Angola in 2014. Around this time, 2014, in fact, April 2014. During which one of the major issues that Premier Li Keqiang pointed out was that Africa needed infrastructure that is pan-African, that cuts across countries and regions and so forth. So Nigeria, because it's located at the heart of West Africa and is seen as the economic powerhouse in the region, could actually leverage on that along with the One Belt, One Road strategy, the so-called Silk Road strategy, to kind of grow its own economy as well as pull up countries in the region such as Togo, Ghana, and others. And
I'm going to jump in here and get the view from Lagos, though, from Mr. Chukwu, though. What are Nigeria's priorities now? Because you have mentioned earlier that President Buhari is now looking more at economic development. From the issues, the main interest for Nigeria in terms of power, infrastructure, transport, road, and agriculture, what are likely to be Nigeria's priorities?
I think there are three critical sectors that have great priority to the country. One is infrastructure. The infrastructure we are talking about basically transport infrastructure. The rail lines, the rail network, the road, the highways, and the seaport. And when you add, and then as well as you add the airports. All the four major modes of transportation in Nigeria are highly underdeveloped today. We just have 2 standard gauge rails in the country. One is still under construction, that's also being built by the Chinese engineers. That's the Abuja-Kaduna standard gauge rail. Then you have the Warri-Itakpe standard gauge rail. Both are still under construction. And we've had instances where the Chinese government had agreed with the previous Nigerian government to build rail infrastructure. There was in 2006, a Lagos-Kanu 1,340 kilometer standard gauge rail that was aborted along the way. But the basic thing in Nigeria, we need a lot of support, both in terms of funding, in terms of technical support, in terms of providing the engineering competence that the China can avail Nigeria of in terms of transport infrastructure. We have the seaport. There is also a seaport under the airport, the Lagos Airport terminal building that is under construction. Then when you add that, Nigeria is also very keen on agriculture. A good thing at the last meeting at the president's visit, the Chinese president did commit to a $15 million support to agriculture. So we need the agricultural sector is very critical, the transport sector is very critical. Then power sector. I know the Chinese, I think the Sino Hydro company was given a contract sometime in 2012, a $1 billion contract to build the Mambila hydropower plant. That was cancelled in 2013. I think those are the areas you have to look at: the power sector, the transport infrastructure, and then the agricultural sector. They are the three critical areas that the Nigerian government will need support from the Chinese government.
Right. Dr. Liu Yufa, though, we saw President Buhari in the United States last year, but it was security and the war against terrorism that topped his agenda there. But we're seeing more trade, economic development here, topping his agenda in China. What are we likely to see, though, moving forward in terms of Nigeria and China relations here?
Looking forward, we could look into these areas where two governments and two leaders from both sides would jointly push the bilateral relations forward. First, the political mutual trust between the two countries, because both China and Nigeria are the major players within the framework of China and Africa Cooperation Forum. Secondly, economic front. Nigeria, right at the moment, needs critically the injection of the cash and also the technology in terms of infrastructure construction and in the development of the manufacturing sector. So thirdly, the technology transfer from China to Nigeria, and fourth, the oil cooperation. This would help Nigeria to sell more oil to China when the U.S. reduces its import from Nigeria. And more importantly, China and Nigeria would further promote the cooperation in terms of the chain development of the oil industry, from the exploitation, processing, and the marketing, and so to speak. And last but not least, it's the cooperation on the human capital, the educational cooperation, Back to you.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for this week, but thank you to my guests for your insights. In Lagos, Johnson Chukwu, he's a managing director of Cowrie Asset Management Limited. In Johannesburg, Dr. Bob Wekesa, he's a postdoctoral fellow at the Witwatersrand University. And in Beijing, Dr. Liu Yufa, he's a former vice president of the China Institute of International Studies. Remember, you can continue this conversation with us online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.